How you guys doing? Woo! Hey, well, welcome to New Life Church. My name is Brett. I'm the lead pastor here at New Life, and if you are new here for the very first time, I would love to get to know you, love to hear your story, how you got here today, how God brought you here, because I believe every single one of us is here for a purpose. It's not a mistake. I love hearing stories regularly of individuals that walked in, and my favorite stories are individuals that walked in not wanting to be here. I hear those actually quite often. I didn't want to come. I didn't want to be here. I didn't want to be a part of this church. I didn't want to do this. And yet for some reason, I feel that this is where I'm supposed to be. And I think that's the way for each one of us. Whether we came willingly or we came reluctantly, we're here for a reason and a purpose. And so you joined us on Palm Sunday, and today we're talking about impact. We're talking about the idea that each one of us impacts each other. Whether we realize it or not, the interactions that we have impact people for generations upon generations upon generations. Simple interactions, just a hello or a smile. We live in a world where nobody smiles anymore. You notice that? Nobody makes eye contact anymore. And yet, just think about the impact that eye contact and smiles have. Just looking at somebody, connecting with them, seeing them, understanding that they're there, just being seen adds value to individuals. I try to wave at people regularly, even walking the halls of this building. This building is packed all the time. You know how often people don't want to look me in the eye? And maybe it's because I'm 6'7". Well, I'm not 6'7". I wish I was 6'7". I'm 6'4"-ish. Maybe it's because I'm tall. Maybe because of title, whatever it is. But we live in a world, even growing up in a small town, you'd wave at people as you drove by them. I miss that. Because even simple things like that has impact. And so we're ending our series in Joshua today. And we're looking at the impact that Joshua had, that as we stand here, we are 3,600 years removed from Joshua, estimated. Could be more, could be less. 3,600 years later, we're still talking about this one person who had an impact. See, every single one of us can also have impact every day with our actions. This past week, I was reminded of that. The Final Four was in town. And during the Final Four, there's an organization that gives away an award. Athletes in Action gives away an award called the John Wooden Keys to Life Award. It's named after John Wooden, who was a basketball coach who won 11 national championships with UCLA, 7 in a row, unprecedented. Nobody's come anywhere close to doing the same thing again. But John Wooden was known more for who he was rather than what he did. And so this Keys to Life Award is given out annually by Athletes in Action to someone who shows, in basketball specifically, an example of what it means to care and love for people the way that Jesus did and the way that John Wooden did. And so this year's award winner was a guy by the name of Coach Beeline, John Beeline, who's University of Michigan head coach. And what was special about this year is that he was introduced by one of his players. As he was being presented the award, it was being presented to him by an individual that he'd had impact on, one of his players. And his player is a pretty special individual, a gentleman by the name of Austin Hatch. If you don't know Austin, you need to Google Austin. Austin Hatch is a survivor of not just one plane crash, but 2. I think there's only 3 people in the world that have ever survived 2 fatal plane crashes. Both of these plane crashes combined took his whole immediate family. Well, 9 days before Austin was in the second plane crash, at 16 years old, the first one happened at 8, second one happened at 16. At 16 years old, he signed a letter of intent 9 days before the plane crash to play basketball at the University of Michigan. Well, not only did Austin lose everybody in that second plane crash that he loved, but he was severely injured. In fact, had a head injury that was so severe that most people don't come out of this type of head injury. They don't make it out of the hospital. They don't survive. If they do survive, 90% of the individuals that suffer this type of injury will be in a bed the rest of their lives. And there's the small percentage that actually make it back. And Austin was one of those small percentage individuals. Not only did he make it out of the hospital and out of the bed, but he committed to play basketball again. And so it took him a number of years, but at some point he actually did. About 4 years later, he got to a place where he could play basketball once again. But he couldn't play it to the level that he had before. And he'd played at a very high level. In fact, Coach Beeline had only seen him play one time. He walked into a game against a really good team, and Austin had a great game, had like a triple-double, 30 points, 16 rebounds, 10 assists. And on the spot, Coach Beeline gave him an offer to play basketball at University of Michigan. On the spot, Austin accepted. He'd grown up in Michigan. It was where he wanted to go. Both of his parents had graduated from there, and he knew this is what he was supposed to do. Little did he know, 9 days later, his life would be completely changed. And so Austin worked his way back, got to a place where he could play basketball again. It wasn't at the level that he could play before. And yet Coach Beeline and his staff came together and said the only thing that we can do, the right thing to do in this situation is that we will honor his scholarship. We made a commitment to him, and even through all of this, even though he was probably never going to play a game for the University of Michigan, they were still going to offer him the scholarship. So Austin came to be a part of the University of Michigan basketball team. He played sparingly. He got in a couple times. He scored a couple points. But at some point, because of his injury, he was no longer able to play. He was no longer able to stay up with his academics, and so became ineligible. And so he took a permanent medical red shirt and became a manager for the basketball team. Yet even though Austin didn't have a very good or very big impact when it came to the box score, what Austin did have an impact on was the team as a whole. Austin became their motivation. He became their inspiration, and he helped them get to a Final Four 2 years ago. They made the Sweet 16 this year. And as he stood on stage talking about what Coach Beeline had done for him, he shared the impact that this coach had had because he'd made this decision to give him the scholarship. Well, Austin ended up graduating. He met his wife, who was a volleyball player at the U, All-American volleyball player. They got married last year, and now Austin travels the world telling people his story and impacting thousands of people because of what had happened to him. But not just what happened to him, but because of what Coach Beeline did for him. And so he introduces Coach Beeline. Coach Beeline gets up there and he accepts the award. And when asked, or when commented on the fact that he had done this, how incredible this was, he humbly deferred and said, "No, I did what anybody would have done. I did what any coach would have done." When they'd heard about the incident, his staff got together and immediately said, the only thing we can do, the right thing to do, is to come alongside Austin through this process. Well, I believe it was the right thing to do, but I don't believe everybody would have done it. In fact, I believe it was pretty special that Coach Beeline came around Austin like this because he knew what it meant to have impact. And that he saw Austin in this moment, said, we're going to do the right thing, but little did he realize the impact it would have for generations to come. As Austin's now traveling the world because of what Coach Beeline did, doing the right thing, the impact that he had, that now thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people will know the gospel because of Austin and because of his story. Every day when we wake up, we have a chance to have impact. We have a chance to make a difference by doing the right thing, by looking at each other, by seeing each other, by smiling at each other, by making decisions that we don't know how they're going to end up. When Coach Beeline gave Austin the scholarship, he had no idea where it would go. He had no idea the impact that Austin would end up having on his team specifically and others at large. And so when we step out every day, we have the hope that we too can have impact. Joshua was an impact kind of guy. And we're going to see the end of his story today. So I want you to open with me to Joshua chapter 24. We're going to be in verses 29 through 33 this morning. Joshua 24, 29 through 33. If you don't have a Bible, I'd love to give you one. We have a number of them on the back table back there. You can take one. It's been kind of fun. Our desire is to give everybody who comes in here a Bible, but if you know somebody that needs one, take one with you. Give them out. I heard of an individual this week who's been taking them, putting their name and email address in them, and leaving them in random places. And then asking the person that picks it up and read it to share their story with them and see where these Bibles go. I think I mentioned a couple weeks ago, my dad had a chance to take one to Cuba, so these little blue Bibles are hopefully going to be all over the world before you know it. So if you're traveling this summer, take a bunch of them. Leave them in random places. I'd love to hear the stories. If you don't want a hard copy, you can download one on any of your smart devices. We use the Bible app. You can also follow along with our notes on the Bible app. I'll be referencing that here at the end. We got some things I'm going to challenge us towards that will be in the Bible app today. We open up the Bible every Sunday and desire that everybody who leaves here will also open it up throughout the week because it changes lives. So this morning, we're looking at the impact of a life that changed many people's lives. And so I want you to read with me Joshua 24, 29 through 33. After these things, Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110. And they buried him in the land of his inheritance at Timnath-Serah in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gash. Israel served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who had experienced everything the Lord had done for Israel. And Joseph's bones, which the Israelites had brought up from Egypt, were buried at Shechem in the tract of land that Jacob bought for 100 pieces of silver from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem. This became the inheritance of Joseph's descendants. And Eleazar, son of Aaron, died and was buried at Gibeah, which had been allotted to his son Phinehas in the hill country of Ephraim. The book of Joshua is an interesting book in that it opens with a funeral and it ends with 3 of them. And so at the beginning of Joshua, Moses dies. If you remember all the way back, if you're familiar with Joshua, Moses dies at the beginning of Joshua. And now we get to the end, and there's 3 funerals per se. 2 individuals pass away, and 1 individual is finally buried. And this passage is important in a number of ways. And the first one is it's the end, right? Which is obvious. It's the last part of Joshua, but it's the end in a number of different ways because this passage signifies for us the signal of complete. This completes the book of Joshua, but in many ways completes this whole part of the Bible. And there's many ways that it does that. And the first one is in the number 3. There's 3 individuals that are mentioned here that are buried. Well, what's the significance of 3 in the Bible? Well, the significance of 3 in the Bible is perfection. It's completeness. It's finality. If you look at what we'll be talking about on Friday and the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, if you look at the significance of 3 within that whole weekend, you see it over and over and over again because it was finished, it was complete, it was done. And so these 3 individuals, by telling their stories in this part, is telling us it's the end, it's finished. And so the author is also kind of recapping what's been going on in Joshua through this process. He's putting a period on the end of it, and he's also giving us some insight into some of the main themes that he's been touching on all the way through Joshua. And there's 2 specific ones that he points us to in the end here. The first one is God's plan will be fulfilled. God's plan will be fulfilled. I titled the series way back 5 months ago, God's Plan, because you saw all the way through the book of Joshua, God's plan being acted out. God had a plan for humanity. He had a plan for Israel. He has a plan for us. And this is a key part of God's plan, and you see it being fulfilled in the book of Joshua from the very beginning. We talked about Moses. Moses passes away. Moses passes away, and yet you see immediately God's plan continuing because Joshua is ready. And we saw that Joshua, from the very beginning, had been there with Moses. So when Moses passes, there's a natural transition of leadership into Joshua. And the Joshua is prepared. He's ready. He's been empowered by God to step up and continue God's plan through the book of Joshua. We see then God step in and continue to enact his plan through his people, through Israel, as they come into the promised land. There's miracles that occur. The Jordan is parted. The walls of Jericho come falling down. And God is working on behalf of his people. He judges them. He forgives them. He blesses them. And eventually he gives them their inheritance in the promised land, just the way he'd planned. We see that over and over and over again. God's plan is coming to completion. A part of this that gives us even more finality in the fact that this is the period on the end of the story and that the author is telling us that this part of the story is over is there's something absent within this passage. Can anybody tell me what that is? When you read this, what's different from the beginning of Joshua to the end? The end of Joshua transitions a little bit differently in the fact that there is a striking absence in the fact that there is not a leader ready to take the people of Israel to the next step. As Moses passes away, Moses' passing is a bridge into the next part of the plan, and yet we see Joshua passing away and there's nobody there to take the mantle of leadership. There's nobody there to continue to move forward. Why? Because for all intents and purposes, this is the end. In fact, if things had worked out exactly the way they were supposed to, this probably should have been the end of the Bible. This should have been it. There's nothing more to do. Why is there no leader? Why is there no person to hand off Joshua's mantle of leadership to? Well, there was nowhere to go. There was nothing else to do. When Moses passed away, he was sitting on the edge of the promised land and had not completed what it was that needed to happen just yet. And so you're left with this tension. You get to this point in Joshua, and Joshua passes away, and you're like, it's over. It's done. There's no reason to hand the mantle of leadership to anybody else, because if they got to this point, why were they brought into the promised land? So they could be with God. That he had provided, he had a plan that he was going to live with them. He was going to be with them. They're being returned, in essence, to the Garden of Eden. And now they're in relationship once again with God, who will lead them. They didn't need anybody else. They didn't need anybody to take them any further. In fact, we see this at the end of Joshua's speech in verse 28 that we talked about last week. Very clearly says what the end purpose of this was to be. It says Joshua dismissed the people, each to their own inheritance. Period. Done. Finished. End of story. There's no reason to move on. They've been given their inheritance. They have exactly what they need. And so this should be a time of peace, of prosperity, of exciting expansion, of being with God, of being settled, of being content. You can put all sorts of different descriptive words in this moment right here. It should be over. Sit down, close the book. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua. Boo, finished. Was that what happened? No. Why? We'll get to that in a sec. Second thing, so God fulfills his plan. We see that in this passage. Second thing, God keeps all of his promises, which is another main theme through Joshua. His plan has come to completion, and he's fulfilling his promises. We see that here in the mention of Joseph's bones, verse 32. And Joseph's bones, which the Israelites had brought up from Egypt, were buried at Shechem in the tract of land that Jacob bought for 100 pieces of silver from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem. This became the inheritance of Joseph's descendants. It seems to be kind of a strange part of the story. Isn't that kind of odd? They've been carrying Joseph's bones with them the whole time. Well, where does this come from? Well, we have to go back to Genesis 50, verses 24 through 26, which says this. Then Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die. But God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land that he promised an oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then he says in verse 25, so Joseph made the Israelites swear, saying, when God comes to you, you shall carry up my bones from here. And Joseph died, being 110 years old. He was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. Exodus 13:19 then says, and Moses took with him the bones of Joseph, who had required a solemn oath of the Israelites, saying, God will surely take notice of you, and then you must carry my bones with you from here. Which first, we got to acknowledge that's quite the feat, huh? If Moses lived to be 100 and some odd years old, and Joshua lived to be 100 and some years old, and Joseph is connected to Moses, and we don't really know exactly how many years between Joseph and Moses, but the leadership line goes from Joseph to Moses to Joshua, we can assume that there was already 200 and some years of carrying bones that was in this period. That's pretty impressive and kind of weird. I promise you, when I pass away, I will not tell you to take my bones someplace outside of Minnesota. If you want to take them to the promised land, that'd be cool. Bury me there, go for it. Dump my ashes somewhere, awesome. But they're carrying his bones for a couple hundred years, potentially 400 years, which if you've moved before, again, that's awesome. I've moved a couple times, and it's inevitable. Every time you move, you lose something. Moved from Illinois to Minnesota, and we still can't find where our box of spices went. Like all of our kitchen spices, just gone. Couple utensils in there, and we have looked, I've scoured through closets, they just disappeared. So who was responsible for the bones? Obviously this was a sacred thing. They had the bones with them for a very, very long time. Why? Because it was a sign of the promise. The book of Joshua was a sign of the promise. What was the promise? The promise was the land. Joseph was the last connection to the patriarchs. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. Joseph held to the promise so much so that in Egypt, as the number one in command of all of Egypt, he's over Egypt, he's in Egypt, but he was not of Egypt. As he dies, he says, there is a place that God will take you. When he sees you, I know that there is a promise that he has made that he will take you to this land. And so when he does, take me with you. And we see God's promise being fulfilled that now, all the way, hundreds of years later, they get to this point, and they're finally able, because the promise was fulfilled, to bury Joseph's bones. It's a really cool moment. A little weird, kind of creepy. But if you think about it, it's incredible. You just sit in that moment knowing that God's plan has come to completion. His promise has been fulfilled. The Bible should be done, over, finished. Story ends. And yet, that's not exactly how it goes. Verse 31 gives us a hint at what's about to take place. Israel served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who experienced everything the Lord had done for Israel. This verse, 2 chapters into Judges, is almost repeated exactly. It says this in Judges chapter 2, verses 6 through 10. After Joshua had dismissed the Israelites, they went to take possession of the land, each of their own inheritance. Kind of give us a recap of what just took place. People served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him, who had seen all of the great things the Lord had done for Israel. Joshua, the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110, and they buried him in the land of his inheritance at Timnath-Heres in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gash. It's telling us what we just read in Joshua to remind us what had taken place. And if you stop right there, if you stop at verse 9, that sounds like a pretty good ending, right? If you read verse 31 and you read verse 8 through 9 or 6 through 9, it tells us that Joshua had died and that generation had followed God all the way through when that whole generation had passed away. Whoo! Fantastic success, victory. Last week we talked about throwing away our gods. These verses give us the idea that maybe they did. Maybe they didn't just nod their heads and go, yeah, that'd be a great idea, Joshua. We should really do that. But maybe they did throw away their gods. Maybe they did do what Joshua said. Maybe his charge at the end of his life made a difference. Maybe he had an impact that he didn't fully understand when he said, go. And now they're going to live in peace and harmony with God. That would be amazing. Just one problem. It says that generation, or they followed God till that generation passed away. Why doesn't it say they followed God for many, 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 many more generations? That would be success, right? That would be impact. That would be victory, that as you read that, they followed God for the rest of their lives, and we don't need a book called Judges. Joshua's the end. It's finished. For generations, they lived and they followed God, and yet you have to read verse 10 to understand where it went after that. Judges 2:10. After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. And the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who'd brought them out of Egypt. Why? I don't get it. We've been reading Joshua this whole time, and they fall away, they come back, they fall away, they come back. God forgives, he brings them in, he pardons their sin, he gives them everything they've ever wanted. And it takes 2 chapters into the next book for us to see that the next generation forgot about God. They walked away. And so I have a lot of questions. A lot of questions as I read this. Namely, so was Joshua even a good leader? If I were to look at this through a leadership lens, through an impact perspective, if I were to leave as the pastor just of this church, and when my son passes away, the generation that sees me passes away, and this church were to fall away from God, what would I think? Failure. I failed. As a leader, I poured my heart and soul into this as Joshua is petitioning them at the end of his life. Do not fall away from God. If you want to choose now, go follow the other gods. But right now, this day, in this moment, choose who you will serve, because for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And the hope is they all jump up and go, yes, and they throw their gods away and they follow. And yet, as we read what happens in the story, they fall away from God. They walk away. And Joshua, as the leader, was he responsible for that? Was Joshua a good leader? Did he actually do everything that he was supposed to do? Well, the answer is yes, he did. In fact, verse 29 at the end there of 29 says these things after these things, Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord. Why is that passage important? Joshua, the son of Nun, servant of the Lord. That passage is important because what it tells us is Joshua did exactly what he was supposed to do. For the very first time, all the way through the book of Joshua, Joshua is given the title, servant of the Lord. Nowhere else in Joshua is that title mentioned. It's repeated again in Judges, which the author of both books then is telling us that Joshua did what he was supposed to do. Moses is referred to as the servant of the Lord over and over and over again, so that he would have been exalted to a place of authority right next to, or below, I should say, right below God's authority. That as servant of the Lord, he was connected directly to God, doing exactly what it was that God wanted him to do. Moses is talked about like that over and over and over again. Joshua, this is the very first time. I believe the author says this at the end of Joshua to put an exclamation point on the end of his story. Joshua, the servant of the Lord. Boom. Powerful. He did exactly what he was supposed to do. I'd love that title. I'd love to get to the end of my life. And even if it's for the very first time, have people refer to me as Brett, son of Dan, servant of the Lord. So I think every single one of us desires that. And when all is said and done, we'll be given that title, but so much more importantly, I think, as you see what Joshua did and the relationship he had with God and servant leadership that he took with the Israelites, the author is probably telling us, too, there was a moment at the end of his life when all was said and done, the exclamation point was put on it, that when he met Jesus face to face, Jesus opened up his arms and said, well done, my good and faithful servant. And yet there's still a lot of questions to answer. Why? Why did they fall away? Why did it happen that way? Is this the way it was supposed to be? And the answer to that is yes. This is exactly the way it was supposed to end. Why? Because it's God's plan, not ours. And we have to be faithful to what he has asked us to do. He will do the rest. It's God's plan, not ours. I look at the end of Joshua going, God, why didn't you just stop it right there? Why wasn't this the end? Why didn't they live in harmony with you forever and ever and ever? Because the goal going into the promised land was to be in unity, to be in community, to be known by you, to be led by you, and yet they go and do all this stuff, and I could ask all sorts of different questions. Why did that happen? Was Joshua a good leader? We could insinuate a number of things, but we can't because the text doesn't allow us to do that. There are no answers to those questions. I could hypothesize over and over and over again and come up with some really cool answers and give you all sorts of leadership knowledge and skill and ability within our world today and say Joshua should have done this, and this with all this information, and yet it doesn't allow me to do that. What the passage does tell me is that Joshua ended well. That he was the servant of the Lord. That he did exactly what he was supposed to do, and it doesn't leave any room for questions. And oftentimes we ask those questions. Why did it have to go that way? Why did it have to be that way? Was there an alternative ending? And I believe the answer is no. There is not an alternative ending. But there's one way that God has planned it, and it will happen that way. Do we have choice in that? Yes. But does God ultimately know where it goes? Totally. Do we have a role in his plan in this world? Yes. We see that in Joshua. But somehow it all gets played in together where it's dangerous if we sit there and start asking some of these questions because it can lead us down rabbit trails that we'll never get to the end of. We'll never get to a place where we have answers, even though we can ask questions all day long. And the text specifically here doesn't give us what we need, so we shouldn't ask those questions. And yet it's dangerous for us at times when we do that because it can lead us away from God rather than to God. Austin Hatch could ask a lot of questions. God, why was I in 2 plane crashes? Why did you take my whole family from me? Why can't I play basketball again? Why isn't my cognitive ability where it was before? I had a chance this week to read an interview where Austin was asked those questions. The reporter said to him, have you ever thought, have you ever wondered, have you ever contemplated why you were the one that was saved and why it happened this way and all this stuff? Do you ever think about that? And Austin said, no, to the best of his ability, he doesn't. Because he doesn't have answers to those questions because he didn't make those decisions. And yet what he followed up with was, he knows his family had a purpose. He knows that he has a purpose. Doesn't know exactly what that is just yet, but trusts that God does. There are times in our lives where we ask the question, why? Where we look at the results or we get to a place where we're going, God, did it have to happen this way? It's not supposed to be this way. What if I did this? What if I did that? What if? Well, the problem is there's no answer to the what if question. A number of years ago, a mentor of mine said, as best as you possibly can, don't ask what if, because there's no such thing as what if. There's only what is. And our responsibility in life is to deal with the what is and put away the what if. And when we get into situations like this, even when we don't understand what's going on, we have to know, God, what is it that you are doing? And he is doing something. Because when we get to the end and we don't get it, or in the middle of it, we don't understand it, I can tell you that God is right there in the middle of it, and he is doing something. Because it would have been easy if we put an exclamation point on the story, if we ended the Bible right here, but if that were the case and the Israelites lived in community and harmony with God all the rest of their days, what would have happened? You and I wouldn't be here today. We'd be on the outside looking in, because if they had fulfilled what it is that God had challenged them to do, if they had done the things necessary, you and I, not being Israelites, would have been outside the community of God. And we would not have the opportunity that we have to understand who God is and the relationship that we have with him the way that we do today. So God, was that part of your plan? I say, yes, it is. It was part of God's plan because there was more to the promise. The promise was that someday a Savior would come and he would save his people from their sins. See, Israel falls away. And from the end of Joshua to the beginning of the New Testament, they continue to look for a leader over and over and over again. They look for someone to save them, for someone to come in to have all the answers. And so God raises up the judges, and he saves people from their sin with the judges, and then the judge dies and they fall away, and that happens repeatedly. And we get into Ruth and we see this example of salvation, that Israel can be saved and they can be brought back in. And we get into Samuel and we see that the Israelites then ask for a king. And so God gives them a king. And they go after one king, after another king, after another king, after another king. And it gets awful and it gets horrible. And the whole time God's sitting there going, why aren't you just coming after me? One of my favorite chapters in that process is Jeremiah chapter 2, where he's going, what have I done? God's speaking to the Israelites, what have I done? Where did we go wrong? Why did you walk away from me? Why have you gone after other gods? I just don't understand. And you see God's heart get poured out as people are trying to find something over and over and over again that will fill the void other than God himself. And then God goes silent. 400 years. There's nothing. And you get to the end of the Old Testament, it is bleak, and it is sad, it's depressing in many ways, and you look at it going, oh, did it have to happen this way? Is there an answer? And the tension of the story is being built until one day, it all changed. When God himself stepped into creation and provided an answer to the problem. That he came as a baby to live a life where he would understand what we have gone through, to be the one that we were looking for, to have all the answers because he'd experienced it. And even though he created it, he lived it, and he went through everything so that he would know what it is that you and I deal with, so we could have a leader that's been there, done that, and conquered it. And so on Palm Sunday, we sit here today remembering that Jesus rode in on a donkey to be the answer to all of the questions. Why did it have to happen this way? Why did they fall away? Why did all of this take place? And the answer 2,000 years ago happened on the cross. The Messiah entered Jerusalem and died for our sins so there would be a way, not just for this group of people, but for the whole world, because that was always part of God's plan. And Jesus was always the promise that was given, that someday all of the questions would be answered. As we sit here today, if we were to put ourselves in the story, we're the Israelites. Over and over and over again, we've looked for a leader. We've wanted to follow somebody. In fact, if you look at our world today, I've said this multiple times, we are so desperately looking for somebody to save us. We want the person that has all the answers, and we keep looking forward when in reality we need to look backward because that person already came. And now we live in a time where we can be in relationship with him just like the Israelites would have been in relationship with God in the promised land, yet we're still antsy. We're still sitting there going, we've been given everything we could possibly have, and yet it's not good enough. I still want something else. Why? The answer came, it was given, and now all we have to do is say yes. And we can live in peace and harmony forever, and we can put an end on the book, and yet we still won't do it. And I hate myself for it because I wake up every day longing for this. We know what we need to look for in the future? The fact that the guy that came 2,000 years ago is coming again, and that's where our hope is. And all these other things we need to rid ourselves of, and all the questions we ask, and the moments we're in, and the places we're at, God's got a plan. His promises are being fulfilled. As we sit here on Palm Sunday, we can look back and see that that happened, so we can look forward and know that God will continue to do it. But in the meantime, we have a job to do. We have a responsibility. We have the ability to have an impact. That every day when we go out, knowing how the story ends, knowing how it's processed through, knowing our role in it, we can have an impact. Just the way Joshua did, just the way Jesus did with the people around him, that we can know that no matter where we're at, no matter what we're going through, even when it doesn't seem like it's happening, that God's plan is being fulfilled. Because God keeps all of his promises, even when it doesn't seem like it. So what do we do in the meantime? What does that look like as we wait for Christ's return? As we long for our Messiah to once again come? Well, we've got to learn from the Israelites as we end the book of Joshua. We've got to listen to Joshua. Throw away the things that entangle us. Throw away the gods that ensnare us. Throw away the things that hinder us so that we can move forward. And so as we come out of Joshua, I want to challenge our community to a season of pushing into God rather than running from him. As we read through the book, as we're ending it now, that we will learn from their mistakes and that we will push into God rather than running from him. And two ways to do that is through prayer and fasting. And so you heard Dave mention it today. Over the next 21 days, actually next 6 weeks, I want each one of us challenge the whole community of New Life, the academy, the church, everybody that's a part of our community, to 21 days of prayer and fasting. So when do you have to do that? Anytime within the next 6 weeks. The hope is that we cap it off May 10th and May 19th. May 10th, we're going to be doing a worship service. May 19th, we're going to be having our annual meeting. But as we end Joshua, we enter a season of pushing into God rather than running from him. And the two ways that we can do that specifically are through prayer and fasting. So there's 4 challenges. We handed out a sheet last week. If you were here at our vision meeting, you had a chance to grab one. If you need one, there's one on the back table back there. It's in the app this morning. You can just click on it, have it available. Or I believe it's on the screen right behind me right now. Yep, there it is. 4 things we're asking. First, go to church. In this season, seems like a no-brainer, but push into your relationship with God, go to church. Second thing we want you to do then is spend time fasting. 4 different levels of fast. Do I have to give up all food? Yes, that would be awesome. 21 days? Yep. Okay, maybe you can't do that. 4 different levels. Full fast, maybe it is 21 days. Partial fast, 21 days of no food while the sun is up. Mini fast, 21 days of one type of food, fasting from one type of food. Or maybe it's a soul fast. Maybe there's something that you need to give up that's challenging to you. Maybe it's Facebook. But I was joking this past week with an individual. It may be easier to give up food than Facebook. Partially because the third part of this challenge is whatever it is you give up, spend that time praying instead of doing the activity that you would have done. The average Facebook user is on Facebook for 2 hours a day. That's a lot of praying. But seriously, what if that actually happened? So over this period of time, push into God and see what happens. I want to hear your stories. We set up an opportunity for you to share your stories. On May 19th, during our annual meeting, I want to be able to share stories of what God has done in this season. And then lastly, be a part of 2 different events. Secret Church, the week after Good Friday, and then this worship service we're going to have. People have asked, how do I pray and fast? What does that look like? What's the importance of it? Well, Secret Church is going to tell us. I know you've heard about it, but I'm going to encourage every single individual in this room to be a part of it. Dave said it's a free event. We're offering it for free, but it's not free. We're paying for it, but we want people there so much so that we're making it a free event. This is the guide that we will have that night. They've already come in. Very professional looking, very exciting. Anybody want to guess how many pages are in here? Take a guess. Shout out a number. Anybody? 245 pages. You want to know how to pray and fast? I got 245 pages of information that will tell you what that looks like. There's 126 scriptural references that will share with you what that looks like. There's a number of different resources that you can have. Just coming to get this as a resource would be worth the effort. Because not only do we want to step into this season over Easter, that's going to be a theme of what we're going to be talking about. It's going to be the series we're doing in the fall as we pray like Jesus. Because we want to be a people that learns from the book of Joshua that we, when we are obedient to God, will see his fruit. Not necessarily the way that we expect, but we will have an impact for generations. 3,600 years later, we're talking about Joshua. 3,600 years. And so what's our responsibility in all of this? To be obedient. What if I never have an impact? What if I never see the fruit of my labor? Guess what? If you're doing what God has for you, you're doing exactly what you're supposed to. And so we can't be discouraged. We can't get frustrated. We can't move beyond. We can't walk away. Instead, we got to push in even harder. And when we do, whether we see it or not, God will use it. Coach Beeline had no idea the impact he would have on Austin Hatch. Austin Hatch had no idea the impact that he would have on my life when I heard his story. I have no idea the impact it will have sharing it with you today as you go out. And there's a ripple effect that happens that for generations from now, because of the actions that we do, the words that we say, the lives that we live, whether we see it or not, God will use it. and his plan will be fulfilled, and his promises will be kept. And someday when he returns, my prayer is that every single one of us will run into his arms as he says, "Well done, my good and faithful servant." Because that's all we can ask. That if I get to the end of my life, and on my gravestone it says, "Brett, faithful servant of the Lord," then I've done everything I possibly can. And so may that be our challenge. That we step into this season asking God, "What do you have of me? How can I be obedient to you? I want to be with you and you alone." And let's see what he does. So Good Friday and Easter, we're talking about that. What does it mean to pray and fast? How did Jesus do it? And then how do we do it together in community? And coming out of Easter, we're going to a series called True Lies, because I understand and we all know there are things that pull us away from God. Things that seem so close to the truth but are off just a little bit. That can pull us to a place where we go after other gods we shouldn't. As we continue in each and every one of our lives to follow after him and him alone. You pray with me? Lord, we thank you this morning for who you are. We thank you that you are a God that loves us, that knows us. Each and every one of us is here for a reason and a purpose today. That you have brought us to this place at this time, at this moment, Lord, to hear what you have for us. And I pray that as we leave this place this morning, that we will go where it is that you will take us from here. That, Lord, we will be obedient to what you have for us, even when we don't understand it, even when we don't see it, even when it doesn't seem like we're changing anything or having any impact at all, even in the mundane, Lord. I pray that we will do the right things, that we will see the people around us, that we will smile, that we will wave, that in the little things we'll have an impact, but ultimately, Lord, that we'll be obedient to you. And then when all is said and done, that you will welcome us with open arms. So be with us today, Lord. Challenge us forward as we head into this next season of pursuing you and you alone. Because when we do, you promise we will find you and you will be there for us. We thank you, we praise you, we give it to you. In Jesus' name, amen.